And hi everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Introduction to the United Nations. This lecture rounds out what is basically a three-part series on collective security and intervention, with us looking at the role of sanctions, more specifically UN-sponsored sanctions against countries, regimes, organizations that appear to be in some violation of international norms, violating the sovereign integrity of another country, promoting some, humanitarian catastrophe, some violations of human rights against a particular group, whatever it happens to be. Sanctions are largely understood to be a form of intervention without boots on the ground, right? So it's somewhere between the rhetorical statement of a need to do something and invading another country. And sanctions are kind of seen as the default option when intervention in a more physical sense is either unfeasible or more likely impossible. Now, the long and short of it is that sanctions, while intending to somehow coerce a non-cooperative country to get back on track, right, to kind of re-engage the international community and see the error of its ways, sounds more good in theory than in reality, right? The long and short of it is that the last 30 years, sanctions have been used repeatedly by the United Nations. In fact, sanctions were only undertaken twice prior to 1990. One in Rhodesia, which doesn't even exist as Rhodesia anymore, and the other one in pre-apartheid South Africa. After 1990, especially with the disintegration of Yugoslavia, constant problems, security threats coming from Iraq, intrastate conflict in Somalia, Rwanda, and then, all sorts of diplomatic non-compliance by Iran has led to sanctions, kind of being this catch-all phrase that run the gamut from some kind of preventive diplomacy to make certain that worse things don't happen, to full-scale economic embargo. And, the question that we're kind of asking ourselves this time around is, do sanctions work? The short answer, no, they don't. But the longer answer is also not really, no, they don't. So, I guess the follow-up question is, why do we still use sanctions? I mean, if sanctions tend to create more problems than we initially had, why do we continue to invest in sanctions? Why do we try to evolve sanctions from more comprehensive ones where everybody collectively suffers to more surgical, targeted sanctions? Even though, right, the regime or the individuals that are being targeted will find ways around these obstacles and these limitations. And I guess the quick answer is, short of military intervention and any other, idea, sanctions are really the best thing that the United Nations has. And this is unfortunately kind of the sobering reality of international studies, especially when we look at the United Nations, is that we would like things to get better. We truly believe that reform can happen, but until that actually happens, we're kind of stuck working with the options and the capabilities that we have. So rather than just simply dismiss sanctions as an utter failure, the best thing that we can do is try to reform them, make them more pinpoint effective, and try to find out ways in which we can somehow punish the aggrieving parties without collectively punishing everyone else within the country. So what exactly then are sanctions? Well, as I've already mentioned, right, they're a form of intervention. And the long and short of it is that sanctions are understood, right, widely understood by at least those that are pushing it, to be some form of action between, as I've mentioned already, diplomatic rhetoric and military intervention in a problematic area. So this, of course, opens up a wide range of opportunity for what could sanctions possibly be. And before we get into the specifics, right, they are, at least collectively through a broad stroke understanding, understood as a way of punishing a non-cooperative state or regime, right? Punishing economically, isolating diplomatically, stigmatizing, at least on a normative sense, or using a country as an example to others about what could happen to you if you follow the same path. Whatever it happens to be, right? Sanctions are a form of coercive diplomacy that is, if nothing else, intended to get the targeted body to re-engage with international cooperation. So if sanctions are considered against a country, you can kind of assume two things. A, military intervention is overkill, and we haven't gotten to that point yet. And B, the targeted regime can still somehow be reasoned with, right? The severity of sanctions might serve as a, form of, reverse psychology in order to get the regime, the party, the leader, the elites, the people who are somehow responsible for creating this humanitarian and legal fallout to correct their policies and somehow re-engage with the international community. And, following this idea, if the country decides to do that, right, they see the error of their ways, they want to make good, we welcome them back with open arms, right? As long as they make good on what they need to do, there's no expulsion from the UN, there's no violation of their own sovereignty, there's no military engagement. In fact, some of the ideas is that sanctions are kind of a way to give the regime fair warning that if they fail to make compliance with this, then more formal intervention is right around the corner, right? So sanctions are kind of like an early warning element of intervention. But sanctions have also evolved over the past 30 or so years, from comprehensive to targeted. And one of the big problems, especially in the 1990s, was that sanctions were, collectively implemented towards everyone within a target country, right? It's a type of collective punishment with the understanding that if the country is diplomatically isolated or, let's say, economically marginalized, whatever it happens, whatever the purposes are, the target audience is the regime in charge. But comprehensive sanctions operate along a way of hurting the ordinary people first before the regime, right? It's sort of understood that the regime, the powers that be, the people who hold authority and leverage, are going to find ways of insulating themselves for a couple of months, if not a few years or so, right? But the ordinary people are going to be inconvenienced, aggrieved. There's going to be a lot of problems that they're going to deal with. Those problems, the argument says, will translate into public protest, pressure on the regime, with the idea that the public will threaten to overthrow said regime unless the people in power, do something different. We've realized that that's unbelievably naive because more often than not, even if the public is aggrieved, inconvenienced, harassed, and oftentimes disenfranchised, the government in power really has no interest in meeting the demands of these people. In fact, in many cases, they can kind of channel the anger and the frustration of the public, not against themselves, but against the very organizations and countries that are implementing these sanctions. So the evolution of sanctions from comprehensive to targeted are really lessons that have been learned from failed policies in Iraq and what was left of Yugoslavia throughout much of the 1990s. I think one major element that was learned is that, particularly with Iraq, right, the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein effectively survives all of the 1990s. But, economic disenfranchisement, political marginalization, malnourishment, humanitarian catastrophes beset the Iraqi people, while the Iraqi government is still living, high and dry. So comprehensive sanctions were widely seen, especially by the early to mid-2000s, as being more problematic than beneficial, because regimes will find ways of insulating themselves and working around these obstacles and limitations. So hence, targeted sanctions now go after, let's say, the financial assets of political leaders, travel bans, more specific economic embargoes on goods and items that are really only something that the upper classes would want. So this is something that we're going to be discussing, right, in the next, few segments here within this lecture. But that still raises the question of why use sanctions in the first place, right? What's the purpose, right? What's the point in issuing sanctions beyond just simply the idea that, well, we can't use the military, so we might as well do something? There's a number of reasons, chief of which is probably the idea of compelling compliance within international law. Right. So whether a country has, committed some violation of, violating, occupying another country's territory, harboring war crime suspects, engaging in some kind of human rights hostilities, sanctions are a way to put pressure on a country to comply with what they need to do. And so whether it's, punitive economic measures, diplomatic isolation, it's a way of providing some form of coercive diplomacy on a country in hopes that they will, change their policies and attitudes. Another reason is simply to contain a conflict, right? If we understand that this could spiral out of one country and kind of spread throughout the rest of the region, then things like arms embargoes or economic embargoes will somehow weaken the state, right? Provide them less leverage to, let's say, purchase security or insulate themselves economically. Countries that are somehow struggling to maintain leverage on security or maintain a certain quality of life for privileged people that keeps the target government in power is going to become more and more costly over the years. And if nothing else, it might not change the internal dynamics of that country, but it prevents that country from becoming a security threat to the countries and the larger area around it geographically. And third, if nothing else, at least as far as those that are imposing the sanctions, they're used as a way of expressing condemnation and disapproval, right? So even if there's nothing else that can happen and the need to, quote unquote, do something about some issue becomes unavoidable. Sanctions are a way of, calling out unpopular practices and sort of showing collective outrage, right? So, one of your readings even goes so far as to mention that sanctions were imposed, rather temporarily, but still imposed, on Austria, of all countries. Austria, first world developed country in the early 2000s, because parliamentary elections had brought a right-wing, populist, anti-EU, anti-global, anti-immigrant party to the position of forming a governing coalition. And, not knowing what else to do, but fearing that this could create a pattern across the European, continent, which, mind you, here I am talking about 20 plus years later. This has already happened, but, think of yourselves in 2000 here. Think of yourselves as an anti-immigrant party from Austria coming to power, right? The European Union feels that they have to do something. They don't know what to do. So they could at least, impose some kind of political sanction on Austria as a way of getting them to think twice about supporting this party in forming a governing coalition. And, in a way, these sort of low-key political sanctions did work. The incoming government lasted beyond the 90 to 120-day period, however long that it happens to be, in forming a government. And as a result, the electoral results were nullified. Everybody goes back to the polls and votes. And this right-wing party, the Austrian Freedom Party, loses a certain percentage of votes and is not in the position to form governing coalitions. So sanctions could be used even as simply as a way of other people saying, I don't like what you've done. There's nothing else that I can really do about it, but I just want to point you out to the rest of the world that you're doing a bad thing, right? You're doing something that is not supported by your neighbors. So sanctions, are certainly, they come in all sorts of varieties. They come in, different elements of veracity, right? But sanctions are, if nothing else, right, a way of showing international displeasure with what one country happens to be doing. And so sanctions are more than just simply, coercive politics, right? Sanctions can be imposed for a number of purposes. One is, as I've just mentioned with Austria, like just simply stigmatizing the transgressor state's actions and violations. You did something wrong. We, at the absolute least, are not happy with what you've done, and we are going to point you out to the rest of the world, right? If nothing else, your name will just come up in the press, and you'll be seen as a non-cooperative member of the international community. So, stigmatizing the transgressor state's actions and violations can lead to a number of repercussions within the economic, the diplomatic, and even the political sphere. Sanctions can also be used to contain the target state in order to prevent it from destabilizing the surrounding region. So if sanctions come with arms embargoes, or asset freezing, or the closing of certain commercial networks and markets to said country, it doesn't mean that the country is going to go bankrupt, and doesn't mean that the country is going to collapse. But the country is going to be financially constrained in the following year. So it's going to make it somewhat difficult for the target country to invest in, arms buildup, military expansion, and if nothing else, it reduces the target country to, just trying to survive, which means that the areas around it will not be as affected by the target country's transgressions, violations, aggressive foreign policy, as we might think. A third option is simply to deter other would-be violators by using one country and setting them as an example. So if we do X to this country, and other countries within the region might be thinking of the same thing, the severity of the sanctions, the economic decline, the diplomatic isolation, the institutional fallout, will serve as sort of an indirect message to these other would-be countries that you better think twice about what you plan on doing. So, for instance, the pressure that was put on Iraq in the early 2000s to comply with UN regulations of nuclear non-proliferation, which was met by, severe consequences if it did not comply, might not have saved the regime of Saddam Hussein. But it did provide enough of a message to the Libyan government of Muammar Gaddafi that they had better come clean. And what is interesting is that by 05-06, right, the Gaddafi government had completely disclosed all information about any efforts that it had made in acquiring nuclear energy, nuclear capability. And by opening the country up to full UN inspection, and by showing that they are now cooperative with the norms and regulations of, the international regime, Libya goes from a pariah state of the 80s and 90s into, very briefly before the Arab Spring sets in, much more of a cooperative country, and one that is able to regain a number of its economic assets and resources that had been previously cut off from them by the international community for the past 15 to 20 years. Sanctions can also serve as a form of preventive diplomacy, right, to ensure that the target state doesn't grow in power and gain leverage. This was something that was used throughout Iraq in the 1990s, and that sanctions were not expected to lead to the collapse of the Hussein regime, but it was meant to weaken the country to such a degree that they are no longer a threat to Iran, to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, to Israel, to Syria, and others. If nothing else, right, sanctions just kind of make it very, very expensive for a regime to maintain this policy and these patterns of non-compliance. Another element of sanctions is meant to build international support for the collective isolation of the target state. So if the goal is further punitive measures against a particular country, you don't go from zero to complete isolation and intervention in one fell swoop, but you start with sanctions, and you use that as a way of building some kind of awareness, right, that a particular country, whether it's Iraq or Syria or North Korea or rump Yugoslavia or Turkey or Democratic Republic of Congo or Russia, whatever, Venezuela, whatever it is that you want, right? It builds awareness among other elements of the international community to kind of bandwagon onto these policies of sanctions. Now, if the idea is to build up collective support for these sanctions, that might also be interpreted by the target country to say, hey, look at all these countries that are stacked against us. Can we afford to go against this? Right? How long can we last before our economy begins to go into the red, before our political leverage begins to wane? So if there is sort of a united front against us, that might also send a message to these countries to say, listen, it's better to cooperate and make good than it is to continue these policies of non-compliance. And finally, if nothing else, right, sanctions are a way to respond to the moral urge to, do something. We have to do something. We have to, create some kind of diplomatic, economic stigmatization, isolation that will be reported in the news. And that should be enough for critics to say that, well, this is all that we can do for the time being, and time will effectively put pressure and reduce leverage of the target's country for them to finally comply, realize the error of their ways, and make good on international compliance. All right, so sanctions are, as I've said, something between rhetoric and military intervention, and there is all shapes and sizes of sanctions, different degrees of severity, different degrees of long-term objective. But sanctions are certainly something to maintain pressure on a target state indefinitely until something is done. And I don't want you to read too much into this, because in many ways, if the cynic in you is beginning to come out after all of these terms, and by the time we get to the urge to do something, or until something is done, you might begin to realize that sanctions are sort of performative artwork by many countries. Right? They know that they're not going to get the target state to change their ways immediately overnight. But it's a way for them to kind of explain to the press, talk to their own constituents that they're doing something, and while military intervention might not be the most popular, punishing the country in focus here might be the only thing and the best way to get things done. Now, how long it takes for things to change, Iraq was over a decade. North Korea has been able to withstand multiple sanctions. Russia has been able to effectively weather the storm for whatever it is that they're doing in Ukraine. And you begin to realize, well, if sanctions are just simply a way for people to pat themselves on the back to say that we've done something, well, then that kind of leads to the understanding that sanctions don't really do things in the long run. So, let's address this question. Do sanctions work? And here I'm going to soapbox a little bit more than just simply, reiterate theory. The short answer is no. Short answer is no. Sanctions don't work, right? For a couple of reasons. Chief of which is that sanctions will often create more problems for the target state and its population. So the innocent will suffer. There'll be a loss of economic income, of humanitarian resources, of electricity, of clean water, of political mobility. There are lots of reasons why sanctions will hurt the innocent well before the actual guilty parties somehow feel pressure. And in the meantime, right, these sanctions will entrench a number of non-cooperative regimes and enable them to look for evasion. So if Iraq and Yugoslavia and North Korea and other countries have proven anything, it's that sanctions, especially comprehensive sanctions, give regimes kind of the strategic and the creative wherewithal to find loopholes around economic embargoes, arms embargoes, diplomatic isolations. And in a way, all they have to do is kind of play the waiting game, especially if smaller countries are now prevented from trading with them and relying on their own imports, targeted countries can kind of realize that sanctions are good if and only if collective cooperation and determination of the international community is guaranteed. So everybody's got to be on board. Everybody's got to effectively say, all right, we're not trading with this country. We're not dealing with them diplomatically. We are isolating them. Now, if you're a big country like the United States, and you're all the way on the other side of the world, you can totally afford to punk a country like Iraq, right? You can totally afford to isolate Russia. But if you're a neighboring country and you're told to go along with these sanctions, which means that you can't trade with them, you can't import, you can't export from them, that's going to hurt your economy as well. So the targeted countries kind of realize that, in an age of globalization and economic interdependence, sanctions need to really, prove their point within a few months. But if you can ride this out over a year or so, well, eventually fatigue is going to set in. Very similar, right? One of the first examples of this was when the League of Nations had imposed sanctions on Mussolini's Italy for invading Ethiopia. Even after the invasion was a done deal and Italian troops were well ensconced in Ethiopia, right, the economic embargoes that were put on Italy began to be resented by France, Austria, Yugoslavia, Greece, among others, because that hurt their economies. So eventually, these countries are going to just simply defect from collective embargo and start working with the targeted country again because their own bottom line is at risk. Okay, so what about long term? If we kind of ride this out, will sanctions work? Also no. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say no definitively, but not really is probably a better way of looking at it, right? Sanctions will eventually be perceived by the target population to be collective punishment, not brought on them by the regime, but by the international community itself, right? The targeted regime has the power to kind of spin the story in the media, the newspapers, local television news, as a way of saying that, the outside community, the European Union, the United Nations, the United States, is now somehow responsible for your economic fallout, for the lack of the goods that you find in the stores. And even though it's the regime itself that is targeted, they've got the ability of, controlling the information and spinning it for their own people to eventually make a good chunk of the population resent the people that are imposing the sanctions as opposed to the government that brought these sanctions on. And the longer this takes, the longer the likelihood that humanitarian problems and a weakening of socioeconomic mobility and capability is going to set in. And this is still felt today in modern-day Serbia, where sanctions in the 1990s put what was a country that should have been at the forefront of democratic transition to one of the last ones to get into the European Union. So we're talking about almost an entire generation being lost, having their economic, their political, and their social capabilities being lost because of diplomatic isolation. And when we look at Iraq, for instance, right, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s, sanctions led to, right, a complete humanitarian disaster in which, at the absolute least, 100,000 Iraqi children, but certainly closer to 200,000, died because of malnutrition and the systemic collapse of the Iraqi healthcare system. And within this, right, the opportunities for cheating sanctions will empower black markets and the rise of the criminal underworld. So goods, services, and provisions that are now being denied people will come at a significant cost. Now, what does this do? It empowers parallel authorities, and eventually it turns the legitimate government authorities into dependent clients of these parallel authorities. So whether it is Somalia, Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, Iraq, you name it, right? parallel authorities, organized criminal syndicates will find ways in bringing these goods and services to the public, but at a significant cost. And eventually, because they are able to do so, they gain leverage, authority, and legitimacy, not just among people, ordinary people, but also among political officials as well. So the opportunities for cheating sanctions will grow the longer that these sanctions are imposed. Okay, so that leads us to ask one very simple and obvious question. Well, if sanctions produce more problems than solutions, why do we continue to advocate for them? Like if we know that it's just going to do nothing more than just kind of slowly kill a country, right? It's just death by 1,000 cuts. And it creates a whole bunch of new problems, entrenched conflicts and other elements. Why do we still propose this, right? Shouldn't we just decide to say, sanctions don't work, there's got to be other ways? Well, the short answer is, it's the default strategy where more invasive measures are impossible or unfeasible. So even though we know that sanctions are not going to produce what we want them to do, it's what we've got right now. And if nothing else, it's a self-serving mechanism by the international policymakers who could then turn to the media, turn to the press and say, well, we had to do something. There's no real collective will or support for military engagement, but we have to do something, right? And so left with whatever options that we have, this is the something that we're doing. And we just kind of hope that, eventually the target government will, come see the error of its ways. Maybe pressure at some point down the road will force them to comply. Right now, this is all that we can really do. And it's not really much of an answer. It's a short-term answer, and it acknowledges what limited options are available. But a more long-term answer, a more long-term explanation for why we continue to advocate for sanctions is that its shortcomings and limitations doesn't necessarily mean that the concept of sanctions should be discounted without any modification or improvement. Right? The last 30 years has shown us that the evolution of sanctions from these cookie-cutter, blanket, comprehensive policies to more do-it-yourself, customized, targeted sanctions, they show that sanctions are still in their developmental stages. Right? It shows us that this is really only the first 30 years that we've tried to do this, and yeah, it's trial and error. It is experimentation. There are going to be fallouts. There are going to be problems. But the fact that we have moved beyond blanket sanctions shows that there is some kind of learning, evolutionary learning within the international community. And if newer incantations of sanctions are able to somehow bypass the general population and go after the things that the ruling regime, the perpetrators, hold near and dear to themselves, well then, obviously that tells us that we should not throw the metaphoric baby out with the proverbial bathwater. So can sanctions be improved? This is where I tentatively be a little bit more optimistic by saying, well, I think they are. I don't think we've reached a point where they're foolproof and that they are, working, but there certainly is a major improvement from that of the 1990s. Right? When we talk about targeted sanctions, we understand that the perpetrators of some problem, some humanitarian crisis, the sovereign violation of another country, whatever you want to make it, okay? These are specific elements of a regime, and even more so, individual leaders. So if sanctions can be customized to go after individuals, right, specific presidents or prime ministers or generals, even more specifically, the extended family and the close network of these leaders, that might be a better way of forcing compliance. Now, how do we do this? Instead of economic embargoes, probably one of the most effective policies of sanctions is the freezing of economic and financial assets. Now, this works especially if we're talking about authoritarian or hybrid regimes, because these governments usually have money stashed away in some offshore account in the Cayman Islands, in Switzerland, wherever it is, even here in the United States. By simply seizing their assets, especially if it is part of, some, stockpile of gold or other precious metals, that puts a significant dent on the leverage and the authority of said regime. On top of that, targeted sanctions can also include embargoes on arms and also luxury goods. I know that your readings like to say that arms embargoes are a great way of forcing non-compliant states to be more cooperative. In reality, arms embargoes are going to be broken no matter what, right? There's black markets, there's other countries, these things will happen all the time. But if you go after luxury goods, right, you go after, let's say, the annual shipment of cigars and cognac, you go after the caviar, you go after the expensive cars, or you, in addition to that, right, what are other luxury goods? You ban their ability to travel. You deny them international services. You prevent their bratty kids from learning abroad. You end up seizing, let's say, their condominium apartments in Midtown Manhattan. You do something to, in so many words, screw with the money. You screw with the personal finances of the people in power. That's going to get them to be a bit more compliant. Right? That's going to get their attention. Right? Blanket economic sanctions are going to be used by the regime in power as propaganda for telling the people that everyone is being punished by the European Union, by the United Nations, by the United States. On the other hand, ordinary people are not going to be all that upset or aggrieved if the bratty children of the, current leader can't, go abroad. Their yachts have been seized. Their offshore accounts have been frozen. The condos that their parents bought them in Midtown Manhattan for $2.7 million or whatever it is suddenly inaccessible and has been seized by the city of New York, right? The ordinary people don't care about that one bit, right? Ordinary people care if, the cost of flour, the price of oil or heating or gas goes up, right? That's when they care. That's when propaganda can be used against the concept of sanctions. When sanctions just simply take away the luxury cars of, the dictator's children, then all of a sudden the only people upset about it is the dictator's children and the extended dictator family. So sanctions can certainly be, improved. In addition to that, sanctions can and oftentimes should come with positive incentives. So, traditionally speaking, sanctions are, large-scale blanket forms of punishment, which, even with, let's say, countries that otherwise would be more compliant if given the opportunity, there's very little reward for doing so, except for the lifting of sanctions, and that's it. But we also find that sanctions tend to just kind of exist in perpetuity, right? They might have been imposed on one country under, one presidential administration. And, unless things really improve, they just continue unabated, right? The sanctions just keep getting renewed every year. And without any kind of positive incentive, oftentimes sanctions will only be lifted once all things have been addressed. But if we, let's say, were to reward compliance bit by bit, a few more carrots along with sticks for recompliance, that might actually get some countries to go along with this, right? So if sanctions are, let's say, gradually reduced, as opposed to reduced all in one lump sum at the end, and this gradual reduction is done for noted cooperation, that might get a number of targeted countries to be a bit more cooperative. One of the best examples of this that your readings give is Libya, which had been under a number of sanctions, a number of economic embargoes by the United States and the United Kingdom since the 1980s. And one of the more egregious things that Libya was associated with, which led to international condemnation, was the bombing and the destruction of Pan Am Flight 103 in 1988, which was largely known as the Lockerbie bombing. This was a commercial flight that had exploded midair and was widely attributed to Libyan terrorism. The masterminds behind the bombing had been protected by the Libyan government throughout much of the 1990s. One of the reasons why Libya was hesitant to give them up is that the then standing conditions were that the perpetrators needed to be handed over to be tried in either a US or a UK court, where it was understood that they would not be given a fair trial. Once the conditions had changed and a guarantee had been sent to Tripoli that the perpetrators would be tried in a more third-party neutral territory and therefore be given much more of a likely sense of an objective trial, Gaddafi had given them up and accepted responsibility. So while this is one of the more exceptions than the rule, the understanding is that if sanctions were to be somewhat amended and given some kind of ability for the targeted country to make good on a few steps, that might elicit greater degrees of cooperation. I think a more recent example of this, at least up until Donald Trump became president, was that the Obama-supported nuclear non-proliferation treaty with Iran that for about a year or so was actually meeting with successful results, came a lot on the idea that continued disclosure and making good on Iran's, abandonment of nuclear weapons technology and capability would be met by gradual unfreezing of economic assets that had been effectively cut off from the country since the revolution of 1979. So, in so many words, by providing some incentives, some carrots to sanctions as opposed to stick, and more stick, it might actually get targeted countries to be more cooperative and more compliant. Again, this rests on one very important assumption, and that is the target country is going to be cooperative and compliant. If they choose not to, well then, there aren't enough carrots out there to compensate for the, nothing but sticks. So in this sense, sanctions, they work only when, right, countries are willing to abide by the conditions of lifting the sanctions. What we found more recently is that countries, if they have the political clout, the economic flexibility, and the military leverage, they realize that sanctions kind of have a time limit in terms of effectiveness. And I think nothing spells this out better than Russia and the repercussions that it is still facing, but is gradually becoming unraveled and weakened, and the Ukrainian incursions of 2014. So that includes Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, as well as their involvement in rebel activity in the eastern regions of Donbass. As a result of that, right, the United States led the charge in issuing a number of economic, political sanctions on Russia, along with the European Union agreeing to abide by these policies. So arms embargoes, closing of economic markets, diplomatic isolation and stigmatization. And the question really is, as far as Russia is concerned, how long will these sanctions last against Russia, knowing that Crimea is not going to be returned to Ukraine, right? The idea is that if Russia decides to say, all right, you got me, my bad, let me return Crimea to Ukraine. I'm going to pull out all support, all military, armaments, diplomatic support for the Donbass region, eastern Ukraine. Let's just go right back to the status quo where we were beforehand. Does that lead to the lifting of sanctions, or is Russia going to do this at all? Is Russia going to renege on their annexation of Crimea? Probably not. So are sanctions now going to be held in perpetuity until Russia does so, knowing full well they're not going to? The European Union has kind of indicated, more so than the United States, that these sanctions are kind of temporary and probationary. In other words, sanctions against Russia are going to last only as long as Russia does not make any additional incursions, additional violations of Ukraine's sovereignty. So if Russia is able to kind of figure out that they've got about 3 to 5 years to, sort of ride this probationary punishment period out, but if they make no other additional territorial gains and they're able to hold on to Crimea, will the European Union be the one to realize the futility of this and renege? I mean, this is a big issue here, especially when we think of a number of individual state economies and their reliance on Russian trade. And this is not just the big countries like Germany, but we're also talking, and if the European Union is working in unison, this includes Greece, Bulgaria, Poland, the Baltic states, Germany as well, Italy, Austria. If Russia is a significant percentage of their import and exports, these countries will somehow be affected as well. Again, the same thing with, the Italian example of Ethiopia in the 1930s, is that you can embargo a country for a finite period in hopes that within that period, the targeted country will realize the cost of non-compliance. But if the country is able to somehow survive, ride it out, move money around, dig up money that they'd squirreled away for a rainy day, just like this, sometimes these sanctioning countries will face bigger economic hardships than the sanctioned, right? And if knowing that Russia is sanctioned by the EU and more importantly the United States, well, what does that have to say about possible alternative markets for Russia in India or China or Turkey or Iran? So sanctions need to be universal, right? They have to be international. If sanctions are only coming from one segment of the globe, while other segments are like, I don't really care one way or the other, well, then the targeted country is simply just going to change its economic portfolio. And since Crimea, right, Russia has kind of, Putin has sort of said, and you can take this however way that you want, whether this is propaganda or whether this is actual strategy, but being cut off from European markets in certain sectors has sort of galvanized a sense of entrepreneurship and creativity within Russia to provide themselves with these goods that they otherwise would have relied on from Europe. And, as long as China and India and Iran are there, there's going to be markets for Russian goods. And as long as China doesn't care one way or the other, Russia's going to say, okay, fine, the European Unions want to trade with me, I'll work with China. I'll work with Brazil. I'll work with Turkey. I'll work with any of these other countries. At the end of the day, if the numbers, balance themselves out, well, you can sanction me all you want until smaller countries within the EU realize this is a losing battle. And interestingly enough, the one country that might be the first to defect from this collective sanction in the EU is Germany. We're not talking about little Greece or little Slovakia or Hungary, but Germany, which relies significantly on trade, on transnational trade with Russia. So sanctions have a time limit for effectiveness, right? If you want to get the point across, you want to isolate a country for their wrongdoing, you need to punish them, you need to isolate them, you need to stigmatize them fast and furious. But if they're somehow able to now normalize the new situation and somehow work it out, work it through, work it out, survive, and somehow, adapt to it, well, then sanctions are a little more than, rhetorical slaps on the wrist. So, I end this lecture not by saying that sanctions are collectively useless, but that, they have their purposes and it is somewhat limited. So a few things that I want to leave from this, comparatively quicker discussion than others is that the theoretical intention of punishing a state, a regime, or a collective organization is reflected in the form of sanctions as punishment and stigmatization. So if sanctions are just simply preventive diplomacy, then the punitive measures aren't really all that severe. If sanctions are blanket economic embargo, well, then it's something much more serious. If it comes with the threat of suspension from international participation. That is serious, right? If sanctions come from suspension in the UN or the EU or NATO, right, it is much more severe and it is much more targeted. But as we've also noted, sanctions oftentimes result in the target group looking for new and innovative ways around embargoes and groundings. Right? The regime in charge has much more flexibility at its hands, at its disposal, than the ordinary people who oftentimes risk economic disenfranchisement, political disillusionment, institutional stigmatization, and effectively just being a lost generation. We've seen this with ordinary people in Iraq, in Syria, in Haiti, in the former Yugoslavia, especially Serbia, right? Ordinary people suffer first. The target regimes usually are the last to be inconvenienced. The second thing to take away is that sanctions work if and only if the target group is willing to make amends and cooperate. Not every country is going to be Libya. And not every country, I'm sorry to tell the New York Times op-ed section, is going to realize the error of their ways in not being part of America's transatlantic globalization network and want to get back onto that, collective, sense of benefit. Just because you have a McDonald's in your capital doesn't necessarily mean that you are really, really, really upset at being turned into a pariah by the United States, Tom Friedman. So if the target group can ride out the siege and expect support for sanctions to wane among some of the weaker members, then the cost of noncompliance that brought on these sanctions may actually be worth the price of unilateral action. In other words, if Russia can ride out the storm from literally annexing another country's piece of territory to its own, and wait long enough for the sanctioning countries to realize, realities on the ground make this a done deal. We might as well just move forward. Then that's what Russia's going to do. And if history has proven anything, it's that sanctions, once it's seen as a fait accompli, they're going to be lifted. We saw it with Italy invading Ethiopia in 1935. We saw it even earlier when Japan took over Manchuria and, the international community realized, what are you really going to do? So sanctions are kind of seen as like an immediate knee-jerk response to something that the world says, hey, that's not right. But we kind of hope that this is rectified within months, not years. And if this continues to, act unabated, eventually sanctioning countries might realize the futility of it and decide, it's just not worth it. So targeted sanctions, on the other hand, appear to be more effective, right? If less consequential for the innocent population. So if we operate on targeted sanctions, sanctioning countries might be more willing to play along, right? In this case, we're not talking about blanket economic embargo. If we're talking about just simply punking the ruling regime, right? Punishing, inconveniencing certain people in power, right? Whether it's arms embargoes or asset freezing, sure, these might be more effective strategies because that means that we still trade with the country, right? There's still day-to-day trade between goods and services. Ordinary people are not being inconvenienced. And the best part about it is that if ordinary people's lives continue on as normal, but the only people that really seem to be suffering are the people in power because they don't have access to their own private money, well, then the ordinary people are not going to be persuaded to support them, right? The regime itself can't go to the ordinary people and say, hey, will you support me because my son needs his condo in Manhattan back? No, the ordinary people are like, I don't care about that one way or the other. Right, so targeted sanctions might be the way to go, right? Because it divides the rulers and the ruled, right? You can't create this rally around the flag effect where everybody is now collectively suffering, right? So that might be one particular strategy, which is being increasingly pursued more and more by the international community. Which leads me to finish off by saying that, sanctions have only become strategically implemented in the last 30 years, right? I mean, really, like since 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. So sanctions are still kind of a trial and error experiment. The models and the frameworks are still evolving and developing alongside a number of international events. So with that said, sanctions have been proved. The track record is kind of bad. Make no mistake about it. And sanctions have certainly led to the perpetuation of humanitarian catastrophes, especially when we consider comprehensive sanctions, right? Comprehensive sanctions that just continue unabated year in and year out run the risk of creating more deaths than an actual military invasion. But I think that most international officials realize the severity and the cost of comprehensive sanctions. If anything, right, the humanitarian fallout from Iraq, from Yugoslavia, from Rwanda, and others have proven the need for more comprehensive, strategically created, targeted sanctions. So in that sense, sanctions are a policy that need improvement, not abandonment. And I think that that is something that is being undertaken now. It doesn't mean that we've reached a perfect model, but it does show, right? It does show that there has been a desire, or at least an awareness in the international arena, that punitive measures need to be targeted towards the actual perpetrators, not the individuals themselves. And if going after the money, going after the individual money, the offshore cash money, preventing them from acquiring luxury goods, preventing them from traveling abroad, elements like this do more to punish and stigmatize not a country and not a people, but a regime. A regime that eventually will lose access to resources and, as a result, lose its ability of patronage towards a certain group of people to keep them in power. So with all of that said, right, I think that basically brings our collective discussion on security and intervention to a tentative close, and it leads us to conclude that in the absence of formal military intervention, sanctions, whatever they may happen to be, however comprehensive or rhetorical, are certainly a way in which the international community decides to engage with a non-compliant, non-cooperative member of its community in hopes of forcing them, coercing them, convincing them, however way possible, to get back into the good graces. Now, if that means getting a rogue regime to see the error of its ways and cooperate while still remaining in power, that's one issue. If sanctions are a way to get rid of a specific government, and we understand that there is no future for them in the international arena, that's another. But these are issues that we can certainly talk about on a specific case-by-case basis. Suffice to say, in the grand argument of sanctions, they have proven to be less effective than originally intended. But if we also accept that the last 15 to 20 years has witnessed efforts to refine and improve the concept of sanction away from comprehensive blanket punishment to specific surgical strikes against the riches, the economic capabilities, and the mobility and the leverage of those responsible in power, well then sanctions, while in need of improvement, do not and should not be the baby that is thrown out with the proverbial bathwater.